Oh no, laddies, I think I might have just shit myself.
Have you ever bought a game in which you had no expectations for? Then said game ended up being one of the best games you've played in a long time, made better by the fact you picked it up cheap during a sale. I recently just had that experience with Prey, so stick around, take a seat, grab a beer, and let's take a look at why this game was a surprise in so many ways. Prey is part of the immersive sim genre, where story isn't so much told through cutscenes as it is told through in-game conversations, emails, sticky notes left under people's desks, and other environmental aspects, many of which are optional and can be ignored entirely if all you want to do is just concern yourself with the gameplay.
Just like Dark Souls.
The design of the game's levels is based on the idea of creating worlds with problems, as opposed to just levels with puzzles, along with a sandbox of tools and weaponry to solve them with in any order or fashion the player deems fit. All of these gameplay elements combining in meticulously handcrafted levels that typically are large in size and combine the benefits of both open world freedom and the craftsmanship linearity. For me, the immersive sim genre has done the greatest job of leveraging the advantages that video games offer over movies. Most games these days tend to go with the start-stop design of cutscene gameplay, which just feels like video games being adapted from Hollywood, instead of taking advantage of the unique medium of video games through interactivity. What you'll notice right off the bat is how quickly you are given control of your character at the start of the game. In fact, this is even quicker than Doom 2016 did it. This is a trend that I like and I hope catches on throughout the industry, as having to sit down for half an hour of exposition before actually getting to move your character is never any fun. Once you get past the intro sequence, something that's immediately apparent is the great attention to detail throughout the entirety of the game. For example, when I was reading an email on a computer terminal, I could hear my fan spinning up on my gaming PC, which meant it was probably overheating. But after I removed my headphones in a panic, I realised that it was the cooling fans on the PC in the actual game itself that I was reading the email off of. There's a lot of other environmental ambient sounds and effects like these, such as the space station you're on is physically rotating in space, and other aspects such as the direction of the sunlight coming through the windows update accordingly. Or, when you're out in space, the equip animation for the wrench changes from throwing the wrench then catching it to your character holding onto it during it instead. All of these details, when combined, play off really well from each other, and every room's ambient sounds are different depending on what's in the room, which is a detail you would normally never notice in a lot of other games, but the quality of its execution in Prey made it so that it became noticeable, but in a good way. Prey is very conscious about keeping you immersed in the game as much as possible. One way it goes about this is it integrates user interfaces into the world's objects, such as a lot of the menu systems are real-time and in-game. Nice touches like having your gun's ammo be a physical display on the gun itself, or by keeping the flow of the game as smooth as possible by having real-time menus when you loot crates and corpses for items, which, even in Deus Ex, you will have a typical menu system that freezes time whilst you inspect the crate's contents, which temporarily breaks the immersion. Having all of these menus in real time also adds tensions, as you can be attacked whilst using them. A problem I've had with Deus Ex games of late is that they are really easy, even on the highest difficulties. Once you understand the basics of how the AI system works, you can run rings around them, in addition to the ability to one-shot headshot almost all enemies. And for those wearing helmets, you can simply just walk up to them, press a button, and they're dead. In Prey though, there are no click to win buttons. The real challenge now present in combat forces you to think ahead, which lends itself very well to the type of game that this is. Ammo is pretty scarce too, and this forced me to thinking about how to use objects in the environment against my enemy, to save using that oh so precious ammunition. Things such as electrical junction boxes, when destroyed, are devastating to anything caught in its shock radius, and explosive red gas canisters can be thrown into enemies which, with the right strength perk, will detonate on impact, knocking even some of the larger enemies onto the ground, leaving them stunned, allowing for you to get in some free damage with the wrench. I'm not sure about you, but I have this obsession for high quality first person animations, and with Prey, it doesn't disappoint. It has this distinctive style to it, like a mix of the old and the new, and when I saw some of the animations in a video, to me they looked a little bit clunky, but for some reason when you actually get access to the controls and you're actually playing the game yourself, they just feel right somehow. The developers also added unique animations for when you discover a new weapon or piece of equipment, similar to how Doom did it, which is always a pleasure to witness. In terms of the gunplay, it's like the good old days before every FPS added aiming down sights to everything. I've heard some reviewers complain about the combat feeling weightless and lacking punch, but for me playing on PC, it felt great. Every swing of the wrench felt impactful with satisfying but not over the top camera shake. Good sound effects, animation itself, and enemy hit reactions all felt really good. The only weapon that did feel off was the shotgun, in that the actual gun itself felt and sounded really powerful, but the actual in-game damage was very low in comparison to what it felt like it was doing. It's only when you fully upgrade its damage does it feel right, but I could understand them doing this as the shotgun could quite easily have been overpowered otherwise. Movement feels great on the mouse and keyboard. It has a smooth yet weighty feel to it. I'm not sure if it's a trait of the engine itself, but CryEngine games have always felt really nice to control on PC. Like they all tend to have this deliberate smooth weight to movement. From a PC gamer's perspective, games like Prey and Deus Ex are a breath of fresh air, as it's a break from the assault of console ports, and what I mean by console ports isn't silly things like having controller button prompts in a PC game. No, what I'm talking about is every facet of the game design being designed around a mouse and keyboard first and foremost. From the gunplay, the speed of the enemies, the UI, and even how precisely you have to look at an object in the world to be able to pick it up. These are all things present in Prey, and you can instantly tell were designed from the ground up to be played on a mouse and keyboard. In terms of the guns themselves, I don't want to talk about all of them to avoid ruining the surprise, but the best gun in the game both in terms of its cool factor and utility has to be the glue gun. The glue gun slows down the Typhon, making them easy targets along with a damage multiplier. You can also shoot it onto walls to create your own stairways to previously unreachable areas, as well as using it to seal gas leaks and extinguishing fires. Another weapon worth mentioning is the foam dart crossbow, which I initially thought was kind of like a jokey Easter egg gun, but I eventually figured out that it's one of the most useful guns in the game, as one of the things you could do with it was being able to operate computer monitors from a distance, and also being able to shoot open door release controls through windows, giving you access to areas of the game what you'd not be able to even get into otherwise. The last gun I wanted to talk about was mainly because it turned out to be a bit of a sleeper weapon, that being the disruptor gun. It works just like a taser, and even in its basic non-upgraded state, it's by far one of the most useful guns in the game, as it locks an enemy in place just like the glue gun does, except without the downside of the glue breaking when you attack the enemy. Once you upgrade this bad boy to max level, I'd say it becomes overpowered, possibly even game breaking, as enemies are stunned for so long that it becomes a bit of a joke really. As mentioned earlier, the enemy you'll be mainly fighting on the station are called the Typhon, an alien species discovered in space during a certain event in time. They come in a few different forms, each with unique characteristics, weaknesses, and abilities. The two main forms you'll be fighting throughout most of the campaign are the Mimics and the Phantoms. The Mimics, as you might have guessed from the name, mimic elements of the environment, which can be anything from a small cup to a large bar stool. When a Mimic's in its imitation form, it will emit a faint audible clicking sound, so having a good set of headphones will give you a good advantage in picking them out. When you get close enough, the Mimic will try to transform back to its natural form before lunging at you, but just before this happens, you get a brief window where if you get a hit in, it will usually kill it in one, without you taking any damage. The second form are the Phantoms, and whilst they can be dealt with without too much hassle, if you go in unprepared against even a single one, you will get your ass handed to you, even on normal difficulty. When there's more than one Phantom in a given area, even with fully upgraded gear, taking them all head on is often suicide. So at all points throughout the campaign, it still forces you to make careful planning before you engage. The game not only encourages you to play smart during combat, but it does so with the environment too. For example, the leverage skill has 3 tiers, and with each new tier, you can pick up heavier and heavier objects. But if you pick up, say, a tier 1 object, the lightest of the 3 tiers, and throw it at a higher tier object blocking a doorway, for example, using the physics of the game, you can just bash the heavier object out of the way, saving you the precious neuromods required to lift the heavier object. There's a class system in the game that includes scientist, engineer and security, and the points required to upgrade these are called neuromods, which are found throughout the game. I prefer having these upgrades be physical objects in the world as opposed to being attached to an XP based system. It's just a much better system than Deus Ex's flat XP based system, as it encourages exploration a bit better in my opinion, and this game also doesn't seem to drown you in neuromods like Deus Ex does with its praxis kits. I went with the engineer class as I like the idea of using turrets, fixing up control panels and setting up traps, so I completely specced out the entire engineer class in my playthrough, and later during the game you get access to 3 new special skill trees which I didn't even use during my playthrough but are game changing in their own way. There's a few moments during the story that require you to go spacewalking just outside the station, allowing you to explore inaccessible parts of the facility due to them having their atmosphere compromised, for example. It's a cool addition to the game, but after a while, I felt it gets pretty old. But fortunately, if you don't care too much for exploring the station from space, you can do the primary objectives then get back inside in just a few minutes. As you progress, you will have to backtrack a fair bit through the station. I don't have a problem with backtracking in games so as long as it's done right, and in this one, that seems to be the case. It's done pretty well. As you progress through the main story, areas that you previously visited have new enemy types in different locations each time you go back there, keeping you on your toes, which is a nice touch. Like with most games, not everything's perfect, and the first thing I notice immediately after getting control of my character is that there's a lowered crosshair, like in some of the Halo games. Fortunately, this can be fixed with a simple eye edit, but I'm not sure why developers do this in the first place. The ambient music in the game is unbelievably loud. I ended up having to turn it down over 75%, as it would often drown out almost everything else in the game, especially during quiet moments. But thankfully, there is a separate audio slider for the music which easily resolves this. Something that bothered me over time was the frequent loading screens between levels. Their existence along with how often they appear were worth mentioning, but I feel that a game that spends so much time and effort on immersing the player in the world to then have it throw a generic loading screen in your face every time you transition to a new level, a lot of that spent effort is lost. If they had something like a decontamination chamber disguising loading screens, it would have been a lot better for the immersion factor. A small thing that I noticed tying further into the immersion was the main UI, where you have your inventory objectives and other things being a non-real-time menu, unlike the rest of the user interface. If they made this a real-time user interface where you open up a cell phone or a tablet and have all of this information displayed on it in real time, it would have helped the immersion a lot better, as I feel myself taken out of the game slightly every time I want to check my inventory, for example. It even looks like they tried to do this, as when you go into the main UI, your character has an animation pulling out a smartphone to his face, which looks like it could have been a leftover idea from development which didn't end up getting finished. A big surprise to me was the fact you couldn't customize the user interface at all. This was surprising as it's the same developer who makes the Dishonored games, and in those you have a lot of control over each individual UI element. But in this you have no options to customize UI whatsoever, which I found to be a bit of a problem, as for example you can tag enemies Far Cry 3 style in this game, letting you track enemies through walls via a waypoint. I would have liked to have turned this off, as tracking your enemies with sights and sounds would have been a lot more immersive, especially for a game like this. There were a lot of side quests in this game, probably an overwhelming amount of them, and they tend to come in the form of finding out who is still alive on the station and trying to track them down. I have only done one playthrough so far, so maybe these turn out to be a great positive for the game, and frankly, it's kinda refreshing to be overwhelmed with content for once in a AAA game. I've seen a few discussions about what combination of perks and weapons are the best to use, and whilst all of the users claim to have the answer to the best setup in the game, none of them could seem to agree on what that actually was, which to me signalled the fact that this game caters well to different playstyles. I think Prey does a lot of things better than Deus Ex when it comes to the core gameplay, with the biggest improvement being the challenging enemies. Deus Ex games have had this problem of just being way too easy, and encounters aren't so much about outsmarting and defeating the enemies as it is toying with the AI and humiliating them in the most clever and interesting way, which can be fun, but I prefer a challenge given the choice. Overall, I went into Prey with pretty low expectations. I mean, firstly, it was a horror-like game, which I'm not really that big of a fan of, and it's a AAA reboot of an old series as well, which is another red flag, but to my surprise, I was pleasantly blown away. The best way I can explain it is playing this felt like going back in time over 10 years, frankly, to what I consider the golden age of gaming, where there were no real pre-order bonuses, there was no season passes, there was no microtransaction loot boxes or anything like that. It's just a full, honest experience for your money. And in that sense, if I had to rate Prey as a whole, I'd say it's one of the biggest breaths of fresh air I've had from gaming in a long time. And seeing as Prey has been out for a while, you should be able to pick it up at a reasonable price.